Well, welcome, Jim, to the Circular Strategies podcast. It's certainly a privilege and a pleasure to have you join us today. Welcome.
It's a thrill to be with you today, Bob. Thanks for the opportunity.
To kind of give the audience some background on GIE, you, the history, and your purpose, maybe talk a little bit about GIE's background, history, and purpose.
So, GIE Media is one of the largest business to business privately held media companies in the country today. And we're a very diversified company and operating in a lot of different industries. But we have one of our business units is anchored in the environmental services space, where we cover the waste industry, the recycling industry, the metals recycling business, as well as the recycling of construction and demolition materials. And our flagship brand in that sector is Recycling Today, which was actually founded back in 1963 as
Wow.
Secondary Raw Materials Magazine. In 1968, as we began to see an evolving kind of environmental movement, the name was changed to Recycling Today. GIE acquired Recycling Today and its affiliated properties in the mid 80s, and I joined in 1991 and have been running the business kind of since that time.
34 years of doing this kind of provides you with an interesting perspective.
We've seen a lot of change, a lot of evolution.
I bet you have. And given that global perspective on recycling, waste, environmental services, what is the single biggest technology or regulatory shift you foresee reshaping the industry in the next 5 years?
I think it's hard to say that there's a single thing, but I would point to the technological evolution within the industry. When I started, most of the machinery and equipment that was used for the recycling process was modified from another industry. It came from mining, or it came from, believe it or not, the timber or the bulk handling businesses. Today, you see a wide range of equipment and technology, all the way up to bleeding edge artificial intelligence being used for materials identification today, that is very purposefully built for the recycling industry. And I think that evolution has been pivotal to the industry. It's helped the industry to both get a lot better at recovering, to be able to, there's an old expression, get all the squeal out of the pig kind of thing. It allows you to get all of the material that people couldn't have imagined being able to recover in the past, but it also allows you to purify and refine that reclaimed material to a quality level that also people never thought about in the past. And one of the things that I often remind people of is they think of the recycling industry as an environmental business or a tree hugger business, but the truth is it's a raw materials business. And we're in the business of reclaiming materials to be introduced back into the manufacturing process. And that is a raw material, a supply chain kind of process. Yeah. A lot of people don't think about that. So I think that the technological change, and then the other thing that I think is the regulatory framework. I mean, increasingly, whether you're in the United States, in Canada, and Western Europe, and frankly, anywhere globally, governments around the world are becoming increasingly aware that, one, there's a lot of value in this material, and we should mine it from the urban mines that exist out there. And two, we have to work to protect our environment, right, from contamination. And end-of-life materials have a outsized possibility of contaminating our environment if they're not properly managed.
Yeah, you also have finite natural resources to consider in the equation, and extending the availability by repurposing or reusing or recycling is significantly important. Go ahead, please.
It also helps, If you look at materials, we were talking before we started about aluminum, and you look at a material like aluminum, the amount of energy conservation that happens as the result
Oh,
of reclamation and recycling as opposed to producing virgin is up to a 95% energy savings in some cases, right? So it's absolutely tremendous the effect that recycling can have.
yeah, when you think of it from a dual mandate kind of concept, you got both incredible value being created in that energy savings as well as environmental impact, whether it's, CO2 emissions or transportation or what have you, it's significant.
Absolutely.
As you speak about regulatory, the environment, are you hearing more and more about the extended producer responsibility across the system, and how is your constituency engaging with that?
So we definitely see this movement towards EPR. I I have mixed feelings about this topic, Bob. I think that producers need to have a higher level of appreciation for what is going to happen to the products that they produce at the end of their useful life. And I don't think today that there's enough of that, right? And so in that sense, EPR can help create that awareness. But at the same time, EPR is only part of the solution, I think, because if we do not mandate the utilization of recycled content, then making people responsible for things at the end of their life really doesn't, it's not going to, it's going to have minimal effect, right?
Hmm.
We've
Hmm.
been hearing from many CPG companies for years and years and years. We're going to do all these great things with recycled content. But the moment that that material costs them a half a penny a pound more than virgin material, they go back to using virgin material, right?
Certainly.
Because
Yeah.
there's no requirement, even though they get the green hype that they're going to do these things, their follow through is not very strong. And certainly there are organizations that have followed through and are following through on their commitments. But that's my concern about EPR. The other big issue with EPR is if you start setting up parallel tracks for end of life materials to enter, you, one, are double investing as a society, and that doesn't make sense. But you also have the potential to create stranded assets for those who have invested, right? And all of a sudden, a regulatory framework comes along that steals, for lack of a better way to think of it, all of the valuable material into an EPR scheme, leaving the least valuable material to go through a traditional municipal recycling infrastructure, for example. And in that scenario, we really hurt a lot of people, a lot of companies who were asked, in some cases contractually obligated, to step up and invest to create infrastructure for our nation. So this is a very, very difficult balancing act that I think legislators, regulators have to think through, and they have to become a lot more informed and become a lot more aware of the realities on the ground, not what they think it should be.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because, in one regard, it's kind of a breakthrough kind of innovation. On the other hand, we're really not thinking about the systematic implications on the overall system. And it seems to be rather consistent with where this fledgling kind of evolution in sustainability is. A lot of breakthrough thinking, some design thinking, but really we need a systematic thinking about it and how the pieces affect each other and how they can work smoother together.
We do. And one of the things I think about is, if you think about Shapiro, you're what are you today, 120, almost 125-year-old company, right?
All right.
Shapiro fully appreciates that much that happens in the recycling industry requires volume because it, it depends on the materials and the values of those materials. But generally speaking, you need volume to offset the core costs that are required to invest in the infrastructure. And so if you start building a model that parses out the volume into different channels, none of those channels end up being especially cost effective, right?
Right.
And so that means that as a society, we actually are expanding our carbon footprint, not reducing our carbon footprint, right?
Yet the hidden impacts kind of come back to full circle to get you for sure.
Yes, absolutely.
Speaking of that, there's a lot of major trends and a lot of things getting hyped today. In your portfolio across the wide array of industries that you cover, what do you believe is currently underhyped or misunderstood by the broader business community?
One of the areas that I would point to is we have one of our magazines is construction and demolition recycling, and mixed C&D, which is mixed construction and demolition materials, is a huge percentage of the overall waste stream. And we spend an enormous amount of money. We ponder endlessly about regulation to try to get another ton of plastic bottles. Now, listen, I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but if you want to talk about real diversion to extend the life of our landfills, and if you want to talk about massive material reutilization, we should be looking at frameworks that allow us to more efficiently divert construction and demolition materials and recycle them to a new use. It is generally a stream of material that is pretty readily identifiable. It is almost by nature segregated from the municipal solid waste stream. And it is frankly very oftentimes readily recyclable. Wood has many uses, whether it's a fuel or whether it goes into an organics utilization and becomes dirt again. We can crush and concrete all day long and create new base road material for our road construction work. There are just many examples in this stream that I think don't get the credit that they deserve, or frankly, the attention that could make a huge impact on our overall solid waste management infrastructure.
Yeah, talk about almost a paradigm shift in your thought process. You really don't consider that construction and demolition waste, when you're a scrap company, so to speak. There are people out there doing it, obviously, but you don't really consider that. You think of the
Yeah,
metals, you think of the.
the volume's huge. The volume's huge. I think that
Ab-
one of the other big things that is, misunderstood that I struggle with continuously is this idea that, we need to regulate and hammer the metals recycling facilities. Metals recycling facilities handle the material at the end of life that somebody else created, not them. And yes, there are times that they're forced in that environment to handle contaminated materials, toxic materials, and then to sequester and manage that material to the best of their ability to safeguard their community. And companies work overtime to do this effectively and don't get much credit for it. They didn't actually create the problem. They didn't actually create the problem. They did not put mercury in automobile headlights. They did
yeah,
not put mercury in automobile trunk lid switches, right? But they get the responsibility to clean it up. And who's paying them to do that? And the answer is nobody. So
th-
those companies, I think, are wildly misunderstood by regulators and legislators. Now, listen, there are bad actors potentially operating in some communities. Every industry has that. It's a tragedy of society, right? We're always going to have that. That is not the bulk of the operators in the marketplace. And
couldn't
and I don't think that operations are given enough credit in that area.
That's a really interesting perspective, and I couldn't agree with you more. Switching to kind of your role as a leader throughout your tenure at GIE, what is one non-traditional skill or piece of knowledge, perhaps outside the sales and marketing research, that has been most critical to your success as an executive?
I would say for me, it's probably being curious, being inquisitive, asking questions. Because understanding the why something happens is usually one of the most critical things you need to try to take away. And I find so often people are very quick to draw conclusions, sometimes based upon limited information. And we all should probably be a little bit more curious than we are. I think it's a great benefit.
I think that's a brilliant answer, and it's sometimes hard in the throes of the day-to-day activity to remain curious, but there's so much value in it.
Mhm.
I have to remind myself sometimes to slow down, ask more questions. You
Yeah.
participate on a lot of industry talks, roundtables, boards. What do you think the most significant insight or piece of common ground you found when collaborating with leaders across all these different sections and sectors of the business, waste, recycling, scrap processors, municipalities? What's a common thread?
Well, I mean, I think that there are several. One is that we have to remember these are businesses. To be successful and to be sustainable in the sense of continuous existence, they have to be able to make a profit, right? The capital requirements for machinery, for land, for infrastructure, for environmental controls, and for people are tremendous. And so these are businesses that have to be able to make a profit. But I also see that very often there's a thread of companies who are trying to do the right thing, to invest for the future. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, to clean up things that others, consumers in general are so used to the idea, I just take my garbage to the end of the curb, and it disappears. Well, it doesn't disappear. And similarly, when one looks at industry and we look at the byproducts of manufacturing and refining and developing products, those byproducts also don't just disappear. They have to be managed. And the companies that manage those, we find, take that obligation quite seriously and invest a lot to make sure that they do it well.
That's
And I also
very
think there's this thematic that energy conservation and conservation of finite resources only grows over time. That we need to constantly become better at it.
No doubt about that. No doubt about that. Speaking of, kind of talking in the present tense today about all of these things that are happening today, but in previous conversations you and I have had, some of what's occurring today, people have been doing a long time, whether it's handling wood and or whatever commodity. And you've seen a lot of people way ahead of the curve in sustainability. Wonder if you'd talk about a few of those, maybe that you're comfortable sharing. I thought that was fascinating because all of us people doing it now think it's novel and it's the first time, and it's far from it.
Yeah, it's far from it. I mean, if you go back to biblical times, there's the excerpt of pounding swords into plowshares, right? I mean, the idea that, metals had value in the earliest days of mankind, and people saw that right away. We've seen so many tinkerers and developers over the years. I think of someone like Alton Newell, who really was the man who commercialized the automobile shredder. He didn't probably invent it. There, you could attribute that invention to probably a few different people, but Mr. Newell certainly commercialized it. And, automobile shredders underpin so much of what gets recycled in today's world. I often ask people, what do you think the most recycled thing that you use today is? And I rarely get the right answer because the right answer is your car. And so I think the work of someone like Mr. Newell is really, really tremendous. But then you also think about people like the Harris brothers, who were some of the first to create big presses to actually size reduce material and create bales of recovered metals, like a bale of hay. And so I think, some of their work also tremendous. But then you look all the way through to people who did the work to develop the first heavy media plants to reclaim metals so you could float heavy metals from light metals and separate the metals in a very, very clean way. Today, we see that being done with magnetics, with near infrared optical sorting. We see it being done with artificial intelligence. And so when I look today at some of the pioneers at the bleeding edge of the industry, whether it's a Matanya Horowitz at an AMP Robotics who really was one of the first to start applying AI to materials separation and sortation. And you look at others who have built that up over the years. But all of this required, active people in an industry like a Jaime Proler to start trying to figure it out, or Leonard Fritz to start tinkering with eddy current separators and figure out how do you tune them to sort different alloys of the aluminum flow that you have to create a much higher value product, right? And so I think that there are just so many examples. I mean, if you look at an MBA Polymers, not today so active, but Mike Biddle's early work in as a recycler, tinkering with how do you sort out all these different plastics and how would we repolymerize that material? There's hundreds and hundreds of stories across the globe of people who have done this. And I use the word tinkerers because most of them start in the beginning without a proven technology trying to solve a problem. And they just keep iterating until they get to the point where they make it happen. And then people think, oh, that was so easy. Yeah, except for the 10 years it took us to get there.
A lot of interesting innovations over the years. And what do you think is the most exciting emerging innovations right now?
Well, I mean, it gets overhyped, but I definitely think that artificial intelligence and its ability to not only help in the materials identification and sortation process, but also help all of us who operate in the industry to understand our businesses better through business analytics and process analytics at just a much, much higher level. So I think that is, to me, it has to be one of the most exciting things that we're seeing, today. The ability for AI to allow you as a recycling operator to dig deeper into your business is tremendous. So I think that's probably one of the cutting edge things.
I agree with you. Everything that I'm experiencing with AI is also the productivity improvement that we will get from it. So, in
Sure.
addition to the insights, how we might better be able to use the human talent that we have around us to contribute and make a difference is going to be very interesting. You
I
know,
think one of the other things that we're seeing today, though, is the realization that we need to do this, that
mhm,
circularity matters, and that we have to
yes,
figure out how to create a more circular economy. And I think that there's a much more broad-based acceptance today of the fact that we have to change our systems to achieve a more circular approach to materials utilization.
yeah, that was really my next question. And so I'll just cut to the chase. What do you think the biggest impediment is in really closing that circular loop?
Well, I mean, listen, I think there are a lot of things, but we talked earlier about, recycled content mandates.
Mm,
Changing an existing system is incredibly hard. And when the economic incentives are aligned with non-circular approaches, then companies are, for lack of a better way to think of it, Bob, they're kind of forced to go that direction because they need to remain economically viable. I used to say this about the when post-consumer recycling was just being started in the sort of late 80s, early 90s. We started collecting all this newspaper, right? Huge volume, tons and tons of newspaper, except the paper mills that existed weren't equipped to take that material, had no capacity to turn it back into pulp, owned hundreds of millions of dollars worth of timberlands and virgin pulp mills. So all of the economic incentives were not aligned around recycling. And it wasn't until we began to see some recycled content mandates that said, you got to have recycled content in your newspaper or you can't sell it. Shift came on the part of paper mills to move in this direction. Now, listen, I am not a big believer in we're from the government, we're here to help you. I mean, I think that private companies do it better. They do it faster at a lower cost with more agility. But there are times when you need to shift the paradigm. And that is harder for independent companies to do on their own. Something has to help facilitate that.
Are you seeing the marketplace require more recycled content? Do you think that's going to be a driver?
It's definitely a driver, and we absolutely see it happening.
Hmm.
I mentioned, particularly in the consumer packaged goods space,
Yeah,
we still see pushback there. You take a perfectly good aluminum can and you wrap it with a plastic wrap for on-shelf marketing purposes, right? So you took a great recycled material and you made it much more harder to recycle. So we just see lots of challenges, I think, in the CPG area.
very good. Last couple questions. How do you see the industry events and publications GIE offers help decision makers navigate market volatility, regulatory risk that often makes investors hesitant about funding new recycling infrastructure. How does that all fit together, Jim?
I think, listen, our business is a business where we seek to provide our readers with business intelligence, insights, and perspective. There's news. That's a piece of what we do, and that's important. But that deeper dive into whether it's commodity markets, whether it's technology, whether it's legislative and regulatory frameworks and the movements of those frameworks, that business intelligence is really what we try to share and what individual companies and managers within those companies need in order to move their business forward, right? In an appropriate way and to understand the landscape and the marketplace that they're going to be operating in. This is a challenge that every business faces, no matter what environment, no matter what vertical market space or industry they're active in. And so we really work to try to bring that content value to them through our print magazines, through our websites, through our podcasts and webcasts, but also through our face-to-face events. And the face-to-face events, of course, bring the added benefit of industry networking and being able to visit with your peers and learn how they're tackling similar challenges. All of us active in our own business every day can get blinders on and we think, my goodness, I'm the only one facing this challenge. And one of the great things about industry conferences, like those that we produce and like so many of the great industry trade associations produce, they help people connect with other people. And as humans, we need to do that. It's really important. But you also begin to learn, my goodness, I'm not the only one facing this challenge. And
Right.
there are reasonable people who have found other approaches that we never thought about. My goodness, how can we integrate that into our business? And I think all of that will not become less important. It will become more important because the velocity of change in today's world is far greater than when you and I were kids. I mean, if you think, Bob, about the business worlds that our fathers had to navigate, certainly they were full of their challenges, but they didn't move at the pace of change that we have to manage today. And so business intelligence is more important, not less.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we certainly take great value in the events you put on and gain a lot out of them. And I cannot agree with you more. Maybe the single biggest change in everything is how fast things are changing and how agile you have to become. And to do that, insights are certainly important.
Yeah.
Lastly, Jim, I'm going to ask you to look into your crystal ball and tell us what you see coming, what it means. And it's the circular crystal ball that I'm asking you about, what it means, and what would you use a magic wand to get done first?
Well, I think that circularity is going to increasingly become important. I mean, if you look at our geopolitical situation, I'm not a politician and I'm not going to go down the rabbit hole of getting into politics, but I'll simply say that there's a lot of thinking out there today that looks like we could be heading towards a more bifurcated world, not a fully united world. And in that bifurcated world, our ability to leverage the natural resources that we have and to get maximum value from those resources will be more important, not less important. In a similar vein, the regulatory and legislative framework that we all will operate in will get tighter. And we see this happening in a variety of different ways. EPR, we talked about here, is just one. And so as a society, we will have to figure out how we do more with less. And I think that'll become increasingly important. If you look at, listen, we've already mined all the easy copper to get. I'm not saying there are not good mines that are well run that will provide value to society going forward. There are. But we have a lot of material out there already, and we need to make sure that we are urban mining, right? That we're capturing from the urban mine all the resources that we can repurpose. And I think the technology is going to help us do more and more of that over time. So my crystal ball is that resources are not going to become less finite, they're going to become more finite. And so we're going to have to get better at repurposing them. And also, I always kind of think about this, none of us inherit the earth from our parents. We borrow it from our children. And so if we want to be able to give them something in the future, we've got to, as a society, protect what we have. And we've got to do that in a wise way that makes economic sense, that can create jobs and keep people employed and create businesses that contribute to their communities. But that all can be done. And so I think this movement towards circularity, towards the realization that resources are finite, we're going to come full circle back to that. I mean, if you go back to when settlers were settling the United States and their horse threw a horseshoe, they didn't just discard it and say, oh, we're not going to worry about that horseshoe. They collected those horseshoes. When they went into town, they turned them in with the blacksmith to get credit on their account so they could get new horseshoes, right? People understood the value of the resources they had. We've probably gotten a little bit too far away from that, too much believing there's always just going to be more, 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 more. There's not. And so, again, we're getting a lot better at waking up to that fact.
Well, Jim, I thank you very much for your time. I know that I'm smarter as a result of this conversation and appreciate the time very much. Thank you.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be with you, Bob. Thank you very, very much. Thanks for all that Shapiro's doing to raise the profile of this.
Thank you.